Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so glad to welcome Al Beardsley from Cirius Therapeutics, the CEO. We're going to be talking about what he calls the 5 Ps for building a biotech organization, the most critical attributes to get funding, build your organization in a sustainable and thoughtful way, and make sure that you can get your asset to the patients who really deserve it most. We're so excited to be able to jump into these topics. Al, thank you for being here today.
Oh, Kim, it's a pleasure. It's great talking to you again.
Absolutely. Before we jump into these 5 Ps, which I'm sure people are really excited to hear about, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your current role at Cirius? You also have a really fascinating history as both a founder and a multi-time CEO. So if you could tell us a little bit about your journey that got you here and what you're doing now, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, just first with Cirius. Cirius, we're a metabolic disease company. Our lead candidate is phase 2, phase 3 ready. We've demonstrated in type 2 diabetes and in liver disease, MASH, great efficacy. And in a nutshell, what we're targeting is the core of the whole constellation of metabolic diseases, which is insulin resistance. By targeting a mitochondrial target, which reprograms how mitochondria and cells throughout the body process nutrients, really resetting how mitochondria work, whether it's in the liver, whether it's in muscle, in the pancreas, or in fat tissue. So you can think of the whole constellation from obesity, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, kidney disease, et cetera. At the core, there's a basic problem with how they process nutrients, and we kind of lump this into the category of insulin resistance. And that's what we're targeting, and we're really excited about that. But for today, Cirius is phase 2, phase 3. The company has been going great for a number of years, has made a lot of progress. And I just joined in September, frankly, for a role in taking it the next step. So not so much the startup role that we're going to talk about today, but more late stage clinical development, et cetera. I'm also chair of a small startup, which is maybe going to be more applicable today. A company called Metallomics, which is going after some really disruptive technology, if it works. And this is a key thing that with almost every startup, that's the caveat you have to make. At Cirius, we know the drug works. At Metallomics, we have an idea. We have some early animal data. It's really exciting. It could change the way that we treat a whole host of diseases, but does it work? So that's the key thing you start with. So I've actually worked this kind of continuum from early stage into commercial stage companies my entire career, because I think that, in fact, drug development and commercialization are a continuum. It's not just discovery. It's not just commercialization. You need to be thinking about those things all along. And I think a little bit later on, we may get a chance to talk about why, even when you're looking for a molecule, you should be thinking about the market. So I've done that at a number of companies, and maybe we can use some examples from that a little bit later on.
It's a really great point to bring up, Al, and one that I think is probably underappreciated in the industry. Many people see themselves as, I'm an early stage person, I'm a late stage person. I like to prepare organizations for launch and commercialization. I like to think about late stage evidence generation, but they rarely bridge the early first in human to how do I also think about the commercial elements, and is this really commercially viable? And I wonder if, especially in the last year, as the environment around us has changed so much, things like the IRA have really forced leaders and executives to think a little bit differently about the commercial landscape as they plan their early portfolio strategies in the startup phase, as they think about their first in human designs. It's not as straightforward as, what's the fastest proof of concept anymore. There's many variables at the table. So not quite focused on the 5 Ps that I do want to get to, but maybe you could give an opinion just on how do we think about all of these dynamics and some of these commercial elements that you've really had the opportunity to bridge. How do we bring that into that early development cycle for an organization that, isn't quite ready to think, should I hire a commercial leader? Do I have the right even people around the table? How do you bridge that?
Yeah, I think first thing is you acknowledge that you have to answer that question. And really, not to front run our 5 Ps, but there's a couple of things that you have to think of as you do that. And that is, one, the product. Does it match up with what the market wants? And when I say the market, early stage, you can really think about this. I hate to keep using Ps, but in terms of 3 Ps. What is it the patients need? What is it the physicians want? And what is it that payers are going to pay for? And this doesn't take hiring a commercial head. Frankly, if you've got the right mindset to be the leader of a startup or the founder of a startup, you know how to go out and access these people. And the first place you start is go look for the KOLs in your neighborhood. By your neighborhood, I mean your city or your region, and go and talk to them about the disease that you're looking at going after, and say, how does this fit with what you need? What do you need? What do the patients need? What are the things that keep you awake at night? And see how you dovetail with that. If you think that, this is going to treat this disease this way, and you go and talk to the KOLs and they're like, yeah, that's really not a problem we have, tells you you're barking up the wrong tree. Patients are a little bit harder to talk to at that stage. So in many ways, you have to use the physicians. But honestly, you can also access payers and say, look, we're developing this, and we have this vague idea that you're only going to need to treat the patient once, but it's going to cost $1 million. Or we think we can make this pill and they take it every day, but it's only going to cost 25 cents. And they'll give you the perspective. They may say, look, this disease is so small, which is actually probably a good thing if you're, as a startup, not too small, and say, so if it works, the FDA approves it, we'll pay for it. Or they may say, this is massive. For example, Cirius is in the metabolic disease space. If you're treating type 2 diabetics, guess what? The insurance companies really care about how much money you're saving them by reducing complications, by reducing the blood sugar and insulin levels in the type 2 diabetic, versus how much you're going to charge them to do that. So talk to these people as people, one-on-ones. The fact of the matter is those payers will actually talk to startups, in my experience, a lot earlier, because you're years from any kind of commitment from them. So they'll share. They want to be helpful.
It's such a good point. And speaking of payers, tends to be such a late stage activity for most organizations when they are preparing for commercialization or wondering about reimbursement, especially organizations that are trying something really novel and game-changing. They're very concerned about agency feedback and how do I get in front of them and how do I make sure that this is approvable because there's no precedent. But they're not thinking about how do we get in front of the payers and those who are going to give us really critical advice on what is it going to take to get this covered? What is it going to take in order to get physicians to want to use this? And one point that you raised that I want to emphasize is whether you're talking to the KOLs or the payers, everything we're bringing to market needs to fit within the care paradigm, within the geography that you're trying to address or you're trying to bring the asset to market within. And that's going to look really different between the US, Europe, Australia. The care pathways are different. And payers can be really great partners in thinking about that early in the development cycle. But it's also critical for some of these early organizations for their first in human to consider those differences. So how do you balance some of that, especially if you're thinking about global studies, global programs, and some of the things you want to build in that area?
Well, obviously, I'm talking from a U.S.-centric background when I talk about payers as if third-party payers are the only way. But you're right. In Europe, it's a whole different game and a longer game. And you can get advice early on, but that's really, I think, a market where you're much better off finding a practitioner who's expert in having those conversations and giving you advice on that. Let's say, for example, China. That's a much more difficult read to make because right now China is encouraging innovation, But at the same time, with the large drugs, they're also really biting the bullet in terms of driving prices down. So China is a much more difficult one. And frankly, I don't know the answer to how you would get access if China is your primary market. So you need to think about, in particular, what am I going to tell investors my lead market is? As a startup, saying this is a global problem, that's fantastic, but it doesn't tell your investors how you're going to get them a return on investment, their first return on investment. There's a great organization out there, the Gates Foundation, that goes after diseases that are truly global. That isn't the first question you have to answer. But for those of us in the rest of the industry, you have to answer that question first. What market are you going after first? And by that, I mean what geography. And then if it's the U.S., there are these things you can do. If it's Europe, like I said, I would advise, for understanding the payer environment, engaging with some practitioners who are expert in that. One other thing I think it's really important when you think about this, the market perspective, is how long you're going to be on the market. And this is something that a startup founder will often either make the mistake or will fail to take into account, which is how long are you going to be able to have exclusivity? In the U.S., we have a kind of bifurcated situation. If you're a biologic, right now you get 12 years of exclusivity. And if you're all familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act and how 13 years until price negotiation. If you're a small molecule, the Hatch-Waxman Act gives you 5 years. So if you're a small molecule, you really have to pay attention to your patents. And one mistake that can be made is filing your patents, your primary patents, too early, because it's going to take you a long time in development. So I advise you to think really carefully about not filing too soon, but not filing so late that either a competitor scoops you or you inadvertently publish and then you can't get a patent on something. Because the large pharma, the large biotech will say that it takes 9 to 13 years of exclusivity for them to really start making the big returns on their investments when they partner with that. So they're looking for that long exclusivity. So at the beginning, when you think about market, we talked about the product and how it matches up with the physicians, the patients, the payers, but also how do the patents line up with how long you're going to be able to own that market.
It's such an important point. And 9 to 13 years for an ROI is an incredibly long time. And especially for a first-time biotech CEO or founder CEO, that seems like it's light years away. And frankly, for an early career CEO building their first organization, they're probably not even thinking they're going to be with the company when they get to the stage of commercialization. So they know they want to set up for success, but it is so far outside of people's headspace beyond how do I get to my milestone of first in human? How do I make sure that my IND clears and I have the opportunity to even test if this is a viable asset? And so how do you balance having the right people at the table? And we're getting into our P's here, but how do you get the right people around the table in order to think about some of those things proactively, convince the investors that you do have a clear path forward, but make sure you're making really thoughtful decisions around these points around timing of your patents and you hire well-intentioned people. People are going to publish intentionally. That's the goal of scientific research. And so how do you really manage the team environment to have those conversations in the early days?
Yeah, I think that people are the most important of the 4 Ps, because you can solve a lot of these other problems, or you can take care of these other Ps if that's something that you have covered is the people. And I think I hate to keep talking about mistakes, because in startups, actually, most startups make many more great decisions than they do mistakes. That's why startups are so exciting. But one thing you have to be careful about when you're looking at people is balancing obvious experience with a startup mindset. Now, what I mean by that is that investors will sometimes love the fact that everybody on the startup team has just jumped out of a big pharma or out of a big biotech, like Amgen or somebody like that. And, oh, look at all the experience they have. But the experience they don't have is not having a staff of 10 or 100 people under them that are taking care of all these details and thinking all these thoughts, or of, frankly, taking care of the day-to-day business of this, or even the global strategy. So I like to say, some people ask me, so what's CEO stand for? And I said, it's not Chief Executive Officer. That's the glory. It's Chief Everything Officer. And the most important skill a startup CEO can have is stapling. And they're like, stapling? I'm like, yeah, I mean that in the venal sense, which is, yeah, sometimes you're the person stapling all the documents together for a presentation, et cetera, but also holding everything together, stapling the whole team together. If you've just come out of being a commercial head, or say a VP of commercial at Pharma X, you probably don't have the skills it takes to see that whole picture, to pull it all together, unless you're the kind of person who really is overdue to be in the startup environment. So when you talk about people, you want people who are going to come in with strategic ability, with experience, but who want to do it themselves and who want to build from the ground up.
Totally makes sense. There's the strategic agility, there's the flexibility. There's a term I hear a lot of startup CEOs and founders talk about, which is we're incredibly scrappy and super lean. We can do this all on our own. We're in a great position. And from an investor narrative, I see the value in saying we're scrappy and we're lean. But on the other side, I see a lot of inexperience and hubris that gets a little bit in the way of, do I have the right experience to ask these really hard questions and know how to answer them, to move that team forward and to elevate that scrappy team to be able to deliver against the milestones that need to happen in those early days. So how do you think about the balance of that scrappy, lean team, if you will, with having the right balance of a team, especially at the high risk, you don't yet have a company, you haven't really proved anything yet. How do you balance that build component?
Well, that's the tough thing, isn't it? Is to attract people when you don't really have a company to say you should come join this company. You're making a really nice paycheck at this large company, or say you're lucky and you can get somebody who has startup experience, successful startup experience, and therefore comes in both knowing how to be scrappy and to do it. How do you convince them to take this over all the other opportunities that they're presented with? And frankly, the fact that they probably made enough in their first startups that they don't have to have a job, so you have to attract them with that. I think you have to get the people you can get, and we'll talk more about how you go about doing that in terms of place. But we've changed the way we do business, and I hear some people say since COVID, but no, it was changing before this, which is, as you think about team, it's no longer just the people that get W-2s at the end of the year. It's no longer about the people that consider themselves employees. It's also about surrounding yourselves with great consultants and great consulting firms to fill the gaps, either in experience or functionality early on. Oftentimes, for the many things you have to cover, depending on where you are in the development cycle, a consultant or a consulting firm is a much better choice than going out and trying to hire somebody who may fill the gap now, but is going to be a liability just because they're not going to fill the gap when you get that IND filed, or when you get that phase 1 completed, or whatever the next stage is. You have to think about that. So I think about teams anymore as, yes, there's some people who are employees, and there are people who are contractors and who are working for multiple companies, and then there are consultants who that's their business, is working with a variety of companies, whether it's within a firm or as a single practitioner. So I think that's what you have to think about when you think about people. And the number one thing as the CEO or as the founder you have to do is realize that you don't know all the answers. And the smartest person in the room is the one who says everybody else in the room is smarter than them and listens.
And ask smart questions. I feel like that's a really key piece. And I will caveat that I did not plant that answer for you, Al, that building a team around you is not necessarily just the conventional team anymore, but it certainly can be a really flexible structure of, full-time employees, alternative models, alternative resourcing. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is how do we make sure that we align incentives across those teams so that we can really feel like one unified organization, which I think is one of the most critical things as we talk about these P's, which we've gotten into a little bit of people, a little bit of product, patents, and pennies, as you refer to it. As we start to talk about each of these 5 P's, I'm really thoughtful about how do we glue the people and the pieces together, whether we're stapling it or gluing it. We could use any of these office references, if you will. But if the team can't work as a cohesive team, the organization is going to fail. And we see it time again where people are operating in silos. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to operate truly as one team rowing in a straight direction. So across these different areas, it sounds like the CEO is really that critical piece. How does the CEO go from being potentially the executive, role for a long time to rolling up their sleeves and being the connector and the glue and all of these different pieces all at once?
Yeah, you make a really good point there, Kim, which is that we can't staple or glue people. We have to make them want to stick together. And I think that's how you make the transition. You need to not think in the old hierarchical sense. And you didn't lead me with that last question. You and I have talked about this before. I think that while leadership, hierarchical leadership, has its role, especially when there's confusion or a crisis, that in this day and age, thinking I'm the boss is the wrong way to come into the office every morning. Think of it as I'm the coach. I'm the general manager. And so what you're thinking about is how do you make people want to do their best there? I'll use an example. The 5th P, since we've kind of backed into all of them, I consider place. And I mean that with a small p. Place classically used to be thought of as, well, if you're going to do a biotech, it has to be in Boston or in the Bay Area or maybe in San Francisco. And that's still, maybe in San Diego. That's still somewhat true, but I think more and more place is a virtual concept. When I see people in our industry talking about return to office, I scratch my head because I look at the largest pharmas, and when you get on a Zoom call with them, the team you're talking to is spread across the globe. So why do you, as a startup, think that everybody has to sit down every morning at 8 a.m. in a cubicle in a windowless incubator to get the job done? That's not the way we work anymore. People should work where they need to work and live where they want to live. So the way you and I are talking right now, I think is the new model for how you put startups together. But now, here's the thing that will determine whether the CEO, she or he, is the right person to lead the team. Can you make people want to come in to get together? If you don't have a physical office, that means get together someplace. But if you have a physical office, make them want to come in. Because if they want to come in, that's because you're building a team. They want to interact face-to-face, person-to-person. They want to go out to lunch with the people that they're with. They come in because they realize that people sit down in a conference room and things happen there, and that's exciting. And I think if you're a startup CEO and you look around and you haven't told people they have to come in, but they're coming in 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week, that tells you you're probably succeeding. or they want to hop on a Zoom call or a Teams call, not just send emails. So, I think that was kind of the question you're asking is, how do you, as this person jumping in from a big organization as a startup CEO, how do you do that? Well, first thing you do is just think about everybody as a person.
It's such a critical point. And I would add that think of people as people and humans, and foster a culture of collaboration where people wanting to work together. That's a piece that most people don't feel they have the luxury of the time to worry about culture in an early biotech environment. They're so focused on what they need to deliver, but the culture and the people are how you're going to deliver it. And so I often think about, in the management consulting world, there's this interview question that everyone kind of gets in some capacity, and it's never a spoken question. It's the idea of the airplane test of, if I'm sitting in a room with you and we're waiting for our flight gets canceled, do I want to grab a drink with you and hang out for the 12-hour delay that we're inevitably stuck for? Or am I going to try to hide in my laptop and run away because I don't want to engage? And so you want to try to create a culture where everybody does want to grab a drink and spend time together. And you want to do that regularly because you actually like each other as people and you respect what they bring to the table. And you create this culture where people know and want to work together.
That is so right. And you say it seems like a lot of work, but it's frankly not. It's all about just how you change your mindset, or how your mindset is. Little things like I give the advice sometimes to CEOs, and these aren't just startup CEOs. These are sometimes well-established CEOs. And I say, you should rarely use the word I. The personal pronoun for you, at least in the business setting, should be we. There is no I. I is only for those rare times when you need to take the blame, or you need to make a decision and make it clear that this is just one of those rare times when I'm going to have to say, this is how we're doing it. I'm saying this. And I think the other thing that you have to do, I have a mantra, and people who've worked with me have heard this probably way more times than they want to hear, which is a great CEO should always take the blame, give the glory. You do things, simple things like that. It doesn't take golf outings. It doesn't take axe throwing outings. Those are nice. Hey, if you got that luxury, and if there's an axe throwing place, 5 minutes away, go and do that with the team. But it doesn't take that. And sometimes it doesn't even take money. Like if you just encourage people, even go with people to grab lunch. Everybody can be paying for their own lunch, but you create this culture of people like getting together. And the boss comes out with us, and guess what? She jokes around with us. And know people as a person. Know families. Ask. Care. Know that they had a leaky window during the rainstorm, and that they came in late because they were mopping up on their floor. And ask them the next day, how's the window? Doesn't take a lot.
Treat people as humans. I think it's the best advice that you could probably give to an executive on how to really engage with their teams, for sure.
And check your ego. Check your ego at the door, because your ego is getting in the way of their ego. And frankly, what you should care about more is your team's ego than yours. Guess what? If you put together a great team and you guys succeed, you'll have plenty of time to burnish your ego.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The last piece that I want to come back to, we briefly touched on the P around pennies, which is really investment. And we've been seeing ups and downs in our industry for the last few years. Some really great funding announcements coming out, a lot of volatility, a number of organizations, unfortunately, completely dissolving at this stage. How do you suggest CEOs in these early biotech organizations balance the 2000% focus on how do I make sure that there's enough dollars in the bank to develop my drug, with these principles of building the team, getting the right people. The right people aren't always inexpensive. And so how do we balance that effort for an early executive trying to build their organization?
Yeah, well, I think I'm an engineer by background, so input minus output equals accumulation. So there's two sides to the coin, pardon the pun, when it comes to pennies. One is raising capital, and the other is how fast you spend it. So let's talk about raising capital first. And I'm going to go to the punchline that I have used in many a boardroom, which is, and no one has yet given me even a single example of this. Show me a biotech that failed because they raised too much money. That's almost a standing challenge. I should have an X prize. If I had $1 million to put up an X prize, it'd be show me a biotech that failed because it raised too much money. And then after the pause and no one can really come up with one, you say, and I'll show you 10,000 biotechs, probably an exaggeration, that failed because they didn't raise enough money. So on the input side, go out, and when you can raise capital, raise it. And, your investors and your board are going to be obsessed with dilution. Somebody needs to explain that the worst dilution is when you shut down the company and everybody gets nothing. On the output side, because this is equally important, and you see this, look, from a startup through an established company, companies are going to expand and contract. And the contracting part is really unfortunate, because if you really are doing a good job with people, that hurts. There is one Boston-based CEO who I watched anguish through this recently when he had to oversee a reduction in force. And he was truly anguished by it. And I in fact, reached out to him. I said, I know you care, and I know how hard this is. But look, that does have to happen. But one of the ways you can minimize that is don't overhire. I see some people that when they go out and raise $100 million, they go and hire as if they'd raised $200 million. Right? So you want to pay to attract good people. That doesn't mean you have to pay to attract 10 good people in the same function. Do you really need 10? Can it be done with 5? Remember, you're a startup. You don't have revenues yet. Be scrappy. Think about back what I said before, using consultants and consulting firms to do things that are episodic, to take up when you've got too much tension in the line, to take up some of that load. And that way, guess what? Consulting firms know when that they're going to have to draw back. And consultants know that I'm a consultant. And if you say, look, I don't need you now for the next 6 months, but if we get to here, I'll be calling you up. That's okay. That's kind of not breaking a bond like it is if you're doing it with a out-and-out employee. So I see this oftentimes when people go and raise hundreds of millions of dollars at the beginning, and they build a startup company with 300 people in it. I'm like, there's no such thing as a startup company with 300 people at it. That's insane. And I apologize to any friends I have who've done that.
That are like, wait, no, I'm still a startup and I absolutely have 287. It's fine. That's amazing. Al, you've brought up some really important points. We have our 5 Ps. We've talked about product. We've talked about people. We've talked about patents, pennies, and place. That really important. What is the culture, and how do we make sure that people know where they're working? When you think about advice to other CEOs, whether they're startup founders or later stage organizations like the one you're at now at Cirius, what advice would you give them, especially at this stage of uncertainty in the market? What's the advice you're giving your friends at this point?
Well, I think when we bring up the current instability, which is just seems to be more and more instability all the time, but honestly, we're in biotech startup. There is no such thing as stability. But the outside, the externalities seem to be unusually unstable right now. Focus. when I'm in a crisis situation with teams, and they happen, I'll admit it, we've had crises at companies I've been at. The first thing I do is a simple phrase that comes from an engineering background, which is work the problem. Don't go running around going, the sky's falling, what's going to happen next week? Work the problem in front of you. And that's what you have to do at a startup when there's all this instability. You can control the things you can control. What are the things that you as a startup need to be doing now? And you're not going to be able to change the external market. All you can do is make sure you're doing the things you need to do the best you can do them. So that's the number one thing. Focus and work the problem.
It's amazing advice. And I know our listeners and many in the industry are really going to benefit from that. So Al, thank you so much for joining today and for the great discussion. Really looking forward to having you again sometime soon.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.